The next paper will be presented by Appel and is co-authored work with Pat Akey, who maybe is also here, and it's called Environmental Externalities of Activism. And you now have 30 minutes.
All right, thank you so much, Bo. So like Bo said, this is joint work with Pat Akey. And before I get started, I just want to say we're in the middle of revising the paper now. It's still very much a work in progress. And so we really do appreciate Jill's thoughts on the paper as well as any from the audience. Now, in this paper, we're studying the effect of activist investors on environmental behaviors. One thing I just want to make clear from the get-go is we're specifically looking at activist hedge funds who buy stakes in firms and usually make some sort of a governance intervention in the hopes of increasing the share price. We are not analyzing the behavior of investors who primarily have ESG goals. Oh, let me make this full screen, sorry. All right, so obviously, as Lucian was just discussing, there's been this emphasis on stakeholderism in recent years. And this emphasis has come from large institutional investors like BlackRock, business groups like the Business Roundtable, as well as policymakers. Now, an important idea underlying this discussion is that there's this conflict between stakeholders and shareholders of a firm. Now, the extent to which this conflict exists is subject to some debate amongst economists. And so, for instance, here's a poll from the IGM Forum. And so it's a poll by Chicago Booth of a bunch of high-profile economists. And back in September of 2019, the poll asked if having companies run to maximize shareholder value creates significant negative externalities for workers and communities. And we see here that over 40% of the respondents either agreed or strongly agreed with this statement. But actually the modal response here was that people are uncertain, and about 16% of respondents disagreed with this statement. And so we see a wide range of responses to this particular question. Now, an interesting thing about these IGM polls is that you can drill down and see individual responses here. And so one of the main trends that emerges, if you look at these responses, is that people say, well, to the extent that there are negative externalities stemming from this idea of shareholder wealth maximization, pollution is probably one case where we would expect to see this. And so, for instance, Darren Acemoglu talks about how polluting might increase shareholder value, but come at considerable social cost. Daryl Duffy points out, well, this is in fact why we have things like environmental regulations. And then Michael Greenstone says, well, if we think about the effect of wealth maximization on stakeholders, there's probably going to be positive spillovers, things like agglomeration, and there might be negative ones as well, for which pollution is an example. And so when we first started working on this paper, sort of the broad question we had in mind was, to what extent do shareholder and stakeholder governance conflict? Now, we're specifically going to be thinking about this question in the context of firms' environmental behaviors. That is, how much emissions does a firm produce? And as I mentioned before, we're going to be studying this in the context of activist hedge fund campaigns. Now, as I mentioned, the reason why we're looking at activist hedge funds is that they're widely regarded as being profit-motivated investors. And so this is in contrast to other types of investors like pension funds or endowments that we usually think of as having alternative goals potentially as well. And there's lots of evidence consistent with this idea that shareholder activism is associated with positive abnormal returns. What we want to think about is, well, to what extent do these returns potentially come at the expense of other stakeholders, particularly those stakeholders that are affected by environmental behaviors? Now, there's a very straightforward story that I mentioned where we can think about why activism might be bad for the environment. It could be that an activist comes in and they cut back on, say, pollution abatement investment because this will increase profitability for a firm, perhaps firm value as well. And this in turn benefits the activist. More formally, we can think about this as potentially activism campaigns facilitate the breach of implicit contracts between a firm and its stakeholders. This is an idea that goes back at least to the late 80s. Schleifer and Summers talked about this in the context of buyouts and employee pension funds. And they argue that, well, potentially buyouts facilitate value redistribution from stakeholders to shareholders rather than value creation. And indeed, there's some empirical evidence consistent with this idea. Pontiff, Schleifer, and Weisbach say that, well, at least part of the gains from buyouts comes from this sort of redistribution. This is an idea that's been talked about recently, even by some managers of activist hedge funds. And so Jeff Ubben, who used to run Value Act, a big activist in San Francisco, talks about that as companies as governed today, with investors asking for more current returns and more buybacks and so forth, aren't working for society or nature. Now, we can also think about reasons why potentially activism campaigns might have a positive effect on firms' environmental behaviors. And so one reason is that, well, maybe activists just care about a firm's environmental behaviors, and they might do so for either financial or non-financial reasons. And there's some anecdotal evidence, in fact, suggesting that when an activist takes a stake in a position, they take some actions in order to affect environmental behaviors. Cliff Robbins, who runs Blue Harbor, talks about how ESG is hugely important, and they put it on the same scale as other things that they look at when they're making an investment, including a firm's cash flow, market share, and its management. And the reason for this, he argues, is that, well, this is simply in terms of risk management. Anything that they can do to reduce risk is smart. An article from the Wall Street Journal back in March gave other examples of activists going into a firm and taking actions to potentially directly affect aspects of environmental behaviors. And so the article mentioned Elliott issuing a letter to Evergy, telling the company to reduce its carbon footprint, or third point, highlighting the excessive carbon footprint for Prudential from having a London headquarters for American and Asian businesses. And so one possibility is that activists affect environmental behaviors through this direct channel. That is, they address environmental behaviors when they take a position in a stock. However, we can also think about potentially indirect reasons why activism might affect environmental behaviors. And so if you think about, well, what does the research say about where do the gains from activism come from? One finding in the literature is that campaigns are associated with operational improvements. And so, for instance, Bravjang and Kim point out that, well, after an activist comes in, there's an increase in the productivity of assets in place, as well as more efficient capital reallocation. Bravjang, Ma, and Tian make a similar point in that, well, when an activist comes in, we see R&D becoming more efficient. That is, firms spend less on R&D, but in fact, patenting goes up. And so an additional possibility here is that, all right, well, if firms are becoming more operationally efficient, for instance, maybe an activist comes in and streamlines some aspect of the production process, this may in fact lead to environmental efficiency. And so you can sort of think about this as, well, maybe activists aren't directly targeting environmental behaviors, but it could be that these other improvements that they're making to a firm have this sort of spillover effect to environmental behaviors. All right, so just to sort of walk you through our main findings in this paper, we find that activism campaigns are associated with a sizable effect on emissions. Specifically, we see a decrease of roughly 17% in emissions after an activist campaign. We find that this effect is primarily driven by campaigns that focus on either general objectives, that is, an activist comes in and says, well, our main goal is to increase shareholder value, or campaigns where the activist specifically targets aspects of a firm's operations. Now, of course, we can't make a causal claim here. Activism campaigns aren't randomly assigned, but it does appear that we're not just picking up some sort of underlying trend when it comes to a firm's emissions. In terms of why do we see this change in emissions, we find evidence that the change is driven by a drop in production for a firm. We don't see any changes in abatement activities. And so this seems to suggest that the primary channel operating here isn't necessarily that direct effect. That is, it doesn't appear that activists are directly coming in and trying to target environmental behaviors. Rather, we interpret the evidence as saying, well, this is potentially a consequence of other things that an activist is doing that affect production of the firm. And finally, we find some evidence consistent with the idea that this drop in emissions has positive spillovers for other stakeholders. In particular, we find that there's a decrease in chemicals that cause harm to humans. So this effect isn't just being driven by inert chemicals. And we also find evidence in a drop in the likelihood of EPA enforcement. And so to the extent that the EPA enforcement targets behaviors that are costly for other stakeholders, this also suggests positive spillovers. And so overall, we think our findings highlight this idea that operational improvements stemming from activism campaigns potentially benefit other stakeholders of the firm. All right, so let me walk you through the data we're using in this project. We have toxic emissions from the EPA. This is called the TRI database. And this gives very granular data for emissions. Specifically, we have the pounds of groundwater and air emissions at the chemical level for each plant in our sample. One thing to note is that this data is self-reported. Misreporting is subject to criminal and civil penalties, however. And it's also important to note that under the TRI, there's no penalties for reporting a large number for emissions. The only penalties are for misreporting emissions. What are the plants in the sample? Plants are required to report to the TRI database if they employ more than 10 people, use a meaningful quantity of one of 600 different chemicals. And so the cutoff for different chemicals are different based on things like toxicity, and if the plant operates in particular industries. And so this database gives us the parent company for each plant, and we use this to match to the targets of activism campaigns. Just to get a sense for what kind of plants we have here, they're primarily manufacturing plants. And so the largest categories include things like chemical manufacturing or transportation manufacturing. In addition to this, there's things like utilities and waste management plants as well. In addition to the main data on emissions at the plant chemical level, we also have information on abatement activities. And so this is also at the plant chemical level from the EPA's P2 database. And so here, facilities need to report abatement actions across 7 different categories. And so the most common are good operating practices. That is, if a particular plant took actions to reduce emissions via these sorts of practices, or things like process modifications. And so we can use this database to create an indicator, again, at the plant chemical level, for whether a particular abatement action is taken. And then finally, we have a measure of production from the same database. And so here, plants are required to report a production ratio. And so this is the ratio for whatever chemical was used to do or produce for this year relative to last year. And so, for instance, if a chemical is being used to manufacture refrigerators, the production ratio tells us refrigerators produced for this year relative to last year. Now, one important thing to note is that it's not necessarily, the production ratio doesn't necessarily capture the final output of the plant. And so if a chemical is being used in sort of an intermediary process, for instance, to clean machines, then the production ratio for that particular chemical would be machines cleaned this year relative to last year. Just a few summary statistics. The main thing I want to point out here is that in our data, most of the emissions, so for most chemicals, there are air emissions. Water emissions or ground emissions are less common. However, if we condition on positive emissions, then we see that, in fact, ground emissions are quite large, while air and water tend to be a bit smaller. We use hedge fund activism data from Bravjag and Kim. This is an updated sample of campaigns going through 2015. Campaigns are primarily from 13D filings, and so these are mandatory filings for when an investor takes a 5% stake and wants to influence some aspect of corporate behavior. We exclude passive campaigns where there doesn't seem to be any indication of activism from our sample. We look at those in the paper in sort of unreported analysis. In total, we have 218 campaigns that we can match to the EPA data. These 218 campaigns target over 1,300 plants and over 5,000 plant chemicals. And then here's just the time series of campaigns that we have in our sample. And this matches sort of the general trend of activism campaigns if you look at sort of the broad universe. Campaigns are rare in the 1990s. However, we see this sort of build up into the mid-2000s, and they stay at an elevated level after that. In addition, if we look at the cars for the campaigns in our sample, this also matches what you see for the broader sample of activism campaigns. We see cars of around 5% or so. All right, so here's the main regression specification we're going to be looking at. The main outcome we're interested in is the amount of pollution. So we measure this as the log of the pounds of pollution. And again, pollution is measured at the chemical plant level. We have an activism variable. This is an indicator that turns on in the year of an activism campaign. And so this is defined at the parent company level. And this indicator stays on for 4 years following the campaign. In our specification, we also include plant chemical fixed effects, as well as chemical by year fixed effects. And so these chemical year fixed effects will help to control for any sort of time varying heterogeneity at the chemical level. And so, for instance, if there's some sort of regulation that affects the use of a chemical, this is something that helps us to control for that. And then in other specifications, we include things like industry by year fixed effects to control for industry trends. And so we have a very granular definition of industries that we use here using a 6-digit NICE code. And then also in some specifications, we'll include state by year fixed effects to try to control for things like local economic conditions. All right, so let's jump into the results. We start out by sort of studying the question of what is the relationship between activism campaigns and emissions. We're going to mostly focus on the intensive margin of emissions, but we'll look at the extensive margin here as well. So first, in terms of the intensive margin here, again, our main outcome variable is the log of the total pounds of emissions. And across our different specifications here, we see that there's a negative relationship between activism campaigns and emissions. In the first column, we're using plant chemical fixed effects. Again, remember our data is at the plant chemical level, as well as chemical year fixed effects. In column 2, we add industry by year fixed effects. In column 3, we also add state by year fixed effects. And so across all of these estimates, we see that the specifications produce broadly consistent results, fairly stable results, where there's a drop of between 16 and approximately 19% in emissions at the chemical level. If we look at the dynamics around activism campaigns, we don't see any evidence that we're just picking up some sort of underlying decrease in emissions at the chemical level. Rather, it appears that there's this sharp decrease in emissions once an activist initiates a campaign, and then emissions stay low in the following 4 years. As I mentioned, we also look at the extensive margin of emissions. And so here we use an indicator for whether a plant stops using a chemical. And we see that there's an increase in the likelihood of stopping to use a particular chemical. That is, a chemical doesn't appear any longer in the TRI database. These specifications are the same as the previous slide. And the economic magnitudes here are relatively large. It's about 5 percentage points, which is a decrease of almost 2/3 relative to the sample mean in the likelihood of stopping to use a particular chemical. I'm not going to show you the results here, but we also find evidence that firms are less likely to start using new chemicals. And so we also see an effect on emissions along the extensive margin here. We can look at different types of emissions, and we see that we see a similar negative effect for air, water, and ground emissions, although the effect seems to be strongest here for air emissions, which, as I mentioned before, this is the most common type of emissions in the TRI database. Next, we think about which campaigns are driving the effects here. And so we separately estimate these regressions by campaign objective. And one thing to note, campaign objectives are not mutually exclusive, so they add up to more than 100%. The categories here are whether a campaign targets business strategy, some aspect of corporate governance, the sale of the target firm, capital structure, or whether campaigns just sort of have a general objective with the goal of improving shareholder value. And when we separate these different objectives, we find that the results are driven by the general category of campaigns or those that target aspects of business strategy. We don't see any effect for campaigns that have the primary objectives related to governance, sale of the target, or the target's capital structure. And so one way to think about these findings is that, well, the results tend to concentrate in a subset of campaigns that plausibly have some effect on the target's operations that aren't targeting, say, the dividend payout policy or trying to sell the target. All right, next we think about the channel. That is, what drives this change in environmental behavior stemming from activism campaigns? First, we ask, well, okay, does this drop in emissions stem from changes in pollution abatement? And so it could be, for instance, that an activist wants to engage in more abatement activities in order to mitigate some sort of long-term regulatory risk. And we're going to analyze this using the EPA's P2 database that I mentioned before. Next, we consider, okay, well, does the change in emissions stem from some change related to production? And so in order to analyze this, we'll use the production ratio in order to shed light on this potential channel. First, we don't find evidence of changes related to abatement activities. And so we construct a bunch of different variables here. And so remember, we have indicator variables for 7 different types of abatement. In the first 3 columns here, we're looking at an indicator for whether a firm engages in any type of abatement. And again, this variable is defined at the plant chemical level. We can also look at the number of abatement actions taken. And so that's what we're doing in columns 4 through 6. And then in unreported analysis, we also look at specific types of abatement. Now, across all of these different measures, we don't really see any evidence that activism campaigns are associated with changes in abatement activities. If anything, the coefficients we estimate here are negative, but they're not statistically different from 0. And so overall, we don't find any evidence indicating that there's changes in abatement activities that might lead to this drop in emissions. Next, we turn attention to production. And so if you'll remember before, the TRI database gives us this production ratio, which tells us the quantity produced for this year relative to last year. Now, we also construct a measure of sort of cumulative production. So this is going to give us a measure of the level of production rather than the growth rate of production. And we do this simply by normalizing the first year that we have data for to 1, and essentially growing this forward using the production ratio. And so we find evidence using both of these measures of changes in production. And so in the first 3 columns here, we're looking at the production ratio, again, defined at the plant chemical level. And we see evidence of a drop in production of about 2.7%. We find qualitatively similar results if we instead look at the level of production, that is where we grow it forward. And so we look at the log of the level of production, and we see a decrease here of roughly 8 to 10%. And so we think that this evidence indicates that, well, potentially this drop in emissions is coming from changes related to operations that ultimately affect production at the plant chemical level. We can also analyze a measure of the efficiency of emissions. That is, what is the pollution per unit of production? And so here we create this variable where we take our emissions at the plant level, the plant chemical level, and divide this by our measure of production. And here we see some evidence that activism campaigns are associated with the drop in emissions per unit of production. In the first column here, we use our specification with plant chemical fixed effects. We see that the result gets slightly weaker, both in terms of economic magnitude and statistical significance, as we start controlling for more heterogeneity here. But it's important to note that both of these measures that we're using to construct this measure are relatively noisy. So, like I said, this is
Ian, are you aware that you're coming up on your time limit soon?
Okay, I can finish up in 2 minutes.
Perfect, thank you.
So let me just say, like I said, we're still thinking about aspects of this project. And one question in particular we're thinking through now is, well, why do we see this change in production? As I noted before, this isn't necessarily capturing the final output of the plant. I will say a couple of things that we've looked at recently. We don't see any evidence of, for instance, of shipping production overseas, perhaps to more pollution-friendly jurisdictions. We don't see any evidence of a change in sales at either the plant or the firm level, though we do see some evidence of changes in product market fluidity. That is, in terms of what plants are actually producing, which potentially explains at least part of what's going on here. All right, and the final thing I want to note is we find some evidence consistent with the idea of spillovers that potentially affect stakeholders. In particular, if we look at hazardous chemicals, we see that there's specifically a drop in chemicals that cause harm to humans. In addition to this, we see evidence of changes in EPA enforcement. That is, there's a drop in the likelihood of enforcement, as well as a drop in fines paid by firms. And this effect is mostly driven by the Clean Air Act, which is consistent with our emissions result being driven by a drop primarily in air emissions. All right, so just to wrap up here, we're thinking about the effect of activism campaigns on environmental behaviors. We find these campaigns are associated with a drop in emissions. And overall, we think these findings highlight the idea that operational improvements resulting from activism campaigns potentially have benefits to other stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thanks. The discussant is Jill Fisch. And if we have a little bit of time at the end, I will try to read out some questions. So all participants are free to type in questions in the Q&A and also vote for other people's questions if there's a question you like. All right. Thank you, Jill.
Great. Can you hear me and see my slides? Excellent. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry it's here in Pennsylvania and not in Sweden, but it's a fascinating paper and an even better presentation. Ian, I really like the direction that you guys are going in, and I really appreciated the context that you put the paper in. So I think that's super helpful. So let's see if I can get this to go. Okay, great. So just very quickly, right, this paper also fits really well with the discussion in the previous session between Colin and Lucian, right? So you've got this debate over shareholder activism. You know, as background, that's Marty Lipton. Marty Lipton says there's no long-term value to activist attacks. Lucian, right, you know, yes, he was here, but I figured I'd make sure he was here. Lucian says, yes, shareholder interventions are actually produce both short and long-term value. And the sort of new feature of this debate that's been ongoing for a long time is stakeholder capitalism, right? So that's the Business Roundtable statement, and Business Roundtable says we share a fundamental commitment, not just to shareholders, but to all of our stakeholders, and we can go back and forth on exactly whether that is a commitment and what it means. This paper says, okay, let's take this theory seriously, and let's use this theory as a way of trying to assess the values specifically that activists might provide, not just to shareholders, but to this broader group of stakeholders. Right. And, you know, motivating question of the project very briefly, how do activist campaigns affect the interests of non-shareholder stakeholders? Evidence shows that they lead both to a reduction in emissions and possibly to more efficient productivity. And we can talk a little bit more about that. So the broad conclusion: benefits, some empirical evidence that activism does provide benefits to stakeholders, and perhaps, you know, bottom line policy implication, let's not be quite as quick to criticize or condemn shareholder activism. So key contributions of the paper. Right. First of all, new data, creative use of publicly available data. I wish empirical projects would do more of this, but particularly when we're looking at ESG and stakeholders and so forth, there's a range of data out there that researchers aren't using, data that for independent reasons, and the authors do a really good job of explaining why this data, you know, we should trust them. This is reliable. This is different from looking at pollution data in a company's sustainability report. So there are a variety of other things that we could use to do a similar analysis. So for example, the EEOC collects a lot of employment data on, you know, pay ratios, on diversity, on employment practices, on job retention that might help us evaluate the effect of activism on employee stakeholders, compliance filings by financial institutions, consumer reports. How do we evaluate the effect of activism on consumers? So I think this is a really promising project, but I think there's a lot more that can be done, and I applaud this project for taking us in this direction. Obviously, it's also really interesting to think about, well, let's evaluate shareholder activism, not just in that same debate, is it good for shareholders, is it bad for shareholders, but how does it affect other stakeholders? So we've seen lots of empirical papers on hedge fund activism. This is really a new direction. Finally, really careful attention to the mechanism, right? And, you know, I tend to fault finance papers for just looking at the bottom line number, but not trying really to analyze how did we get there. I think the authors do a really good job. And in particular, you know, is this about production changes or abatement? And is this efficiency gains? How does this relate to the plant's overall productivity? So I think all of this is really exciting. I have a couple of questions, and they're not criticisms. It's a work in progress. They're questions. They're things that I hope the authors will address more, but they certainly don't take away from my general support for the paper. So first of all, the sample's pretty small. It's pretty small, not in overall size, but in the percentage of activist events that it represents. And that's just, that's the nature of the data. There are just not that many companies that have to report this kind of pollution data. But 218 events is a relatively small proportion of overall activist engagements. And I wonder the extent to which this sample is representative, right? Our chemical plants are the kind of companies that do this kind of manufacturing. Are they different? And can we really infer, from time to time, the paper makes broad conclusions about activism. I'm just not entirely sure about the connection. I'd like to see the authors address that point a little more carefully. Second, can we learn a little bit more about the mechanism, not from the plant side, but from the activism side? So there are papers that look at activist campaigns and talk about, well, was the activist successful? At the end of the day, did the activist do what the activist said it was trying to do when it got started? Did the activist get board representation? Is the activity at the plant the result of doing what the activist wanted, or is the plant taking some sort of defensive measures to ward off the activist that maybe have the effect of promoting stakeholder value or reducing harmful emissions? So again, something that I think there is a basis in the existing literature for that could be incorporated here. Third, is this really stakeholder capitalism? So Ian, you mentioned this a little bit in your presentation. There's a lot of, at least, claim by hedge funds that environmental risk is an important financial risk. We see this in statements. The head of sustainability at Elliott Management came to a program that we had last December, and she was talking about the fact that, all of this stuff matters from an investment perspective. We don't want to invest in a firm that has huge environmental liabilities. We don't want to invest in a firm that has a toxic incident, while we're a big undiversified investor. That's a problem for us. You see this in the SEC's requirements that firms report more about climate change and other kinds of environmental risks, right? The SEC is focused on financial effects, but it sees that connection. And I think with hedge funds, there's even more. I think a firm's attention to environmental or ESG issues might be a signal, might be a marker. Responsive management, hey, this is on everybody's table, on everybody's agenda. A firm that's not paying attention might be problematic, right? And obviously management quality or the potential to improve management quality is one thing that might get a firm involved. So just some things to think about. Finally, and perhaps the issue that I don't find this troubling in the paper, but I find this troubling in the broader stakeholder debate. So the Business Roundtable statement says each of our stakeholders is essential, right? This paper focuses on environmental harm. To what extent is this about increasing overall productivity? And to what extent is this just shifting who benefits? So a lot of activist efforts, and this is actually a criticism of activist efforts, is that they're trying to eliminate older, less profitable operations. They're trying to shift the company's line of business, focus on the products and the services that are most efficient. But this has an effect on other stakeholders. It has an effect on employees, customers, local communities, right? Canadian think tank said after firms were targeted by activists, employment shrunk 20%. So are firms cutting emissions, but also cutting jobs? And what does that mean for the sort of big policy question that you put up front? Is activism good for stakeholders? Right now, I don't know. I mean, nobody's really come up. Lucian raised this issue, but nobody's really come up to my mind with a really good way of weighing or balancing the interests of competing stakeholders, right? That's something that's kind of unsatisfying about the stakeholder debate. But I think it at least bears a little more examination in this paper, right? So, standard activist critique, activists cut costs, they downsize operations, they close plants, and they eliminate R&D. I don't know how much your story is consistent or kind of goes further. And obviously the extent to which you look at productivity, right, in part is an effort to address that. But, a couple of anecdotes, a couple of sort of cases to think about, right? So Trian, hedge fund, targeted DuPont, chemical company, right? I think it's after your sample, but the reason I looked at it, it's the kind of company that I think your sample, includes, right? It cut R&D, right? This is a defensive measure. So ultimately the activist wasn't successful. DuPont cut R&D. It pursued a merger with Dow Chemical, which I suspect would have cut overall use of some chemicals, and it eliminated 10% of its workforce, right? So that's one of the plants that was at least targeted for cutbacks as a result of the activism. Second example, Carl Icahn targeted Xerox, right there, Xerox, right? At his urging, Xerox cut 5,000 jobs, slashed costs, and split the company in two. Starboard targeted Wausau Paper, leading to the closing of Wisconsin paper mill. Well, paper mills pollute. It was an old paper mill. It probably used a disproportionate amount of bad chemicals. It bankrupted a small town. Starboard also told Wausau to get out of product lines that included toilet paper and paper towels. Those weren't the most efficient ways, according to Starboard, for Wausau to use its productivity, right? So, problem for the town, problem for the mill employees, that's the specific mill that was closed. But there's another group of stakeholders we might think about, and that's customers. And, at least in the last 6 months, that really efficient productivity that Starboard was promoting hasn't been too good for customers who have faced shortages in toilet paper and paper towels. So bottom line, it's a great paper. It's a timely and important topic. It's a great empirical strategy. You're using also really creative tools for sort of doing a nuanced evaluation of firm value. And I think it has important implications. There's all sorts of issues, all sorts of proposals on the regulatory agenda designed to curb shareholder activism. And your paper says, well, hey, let's think about this a little more carefully before we cut something that we haven't fully analyzed from an empirical perspective. So thanks for the opportunity to comment.
Thank you very much, Jill. I used the moderator's privilege to rob us all of the last break. And I feel I can't do that again. And the break that's coming up is supposed to start now, and it's only 5 minutes. So I'm actually going to call it here, although I'm sure there's all kinds of comments on this, and there were interesting questions raised in the Q&A. We will take a 5-minute break, and we'll start again at 4:20 European time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jill.
Bo, you still there?
I'm here.
Ian, are you still there?
I am here, yes.
So I love this project. So I just
thank you very much for your comments. I completely agree. In terms like we've been thinking about that in particular lately in terms of the EPA penalties and financial risks. If you sort of do a back of the envelope based on the realized EPA penalties that we have, it's hard to square with the idea that this is primarily driven by that, simply because the penalties aren't that large to begin with. And the activist only captures, a relatively small amount of that. But it is hard to rule that out because there could be, very unlikely events that potentially impose huge costs.
Big tails, like BP or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that like in particular, we can probably only talk about, we can think about measuring it to an extent. But I think that's a fair point. That probably is part of the story here, at least.
Yeah, I don't think any of these comments are problematic for you. I think it mostly has to do with just kind of a mention or an acknowledgement that that this is a potential issue, and you move on. It doesn't undercut your empirical results.
Yeah, I think so, but I think that is an important point that we should spend more time talking about in the paper for sure.
I mean, the one other thing that you might look at, and it may be too much for this paper, and it may need to be a separate project, but there is EEOC data on jobs and sort of, job cuts and things, general employment data.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be interesting to just incorporate a very crude, not doing the same kind of deep dive, but using something like employment level or change of employment as some sort of control here.
No, that is something we can account. The paper, Alan and Wei have it when they look at the real effects of activism. They do pick up some effect on employment and things like wages, and so that's something we can try to control for. But I think it sort of speaks to your last point there, which is like it is a really complicated story if you're thinking about sort of general welfare effects here. It's hard to sort of make that calculation and conclude, because there's probably some negative effects on stakeholders. We're arguing that, well, maybe all those effects aren't necessarily negative, but what's the overall effect? I think that's a tricky question, but ultimately the most important question, I think, when it comes to activists and ESG.
And there's no reason that that one paper should even try to answer that. But I think, there are a couple of places where your language is a little bit broad. And, I think it needs to be just a little bit more clear that you're not trying to answer that bigger question, right? This is kind of a first step.
That's a good point. Pat, did you have anything?
No, I just want to say thanks for a great set of comments, and in particular, we are figuring out sort of the direction for the paper, and in particular, your comments on sort of the framing, I think, are actually very much in line with what we were thinking about, but sort of put in a more concise way. So this will be very helpful for us.
Cool, good. Well, your paper is going to get a lot of pickup, not just in finance, but in the law community. So.
Thank you. And then there were a couple of questions actually in chat that I might just take a minute to talk about here. So in particular, Per had asked about to what extent this is coming from plants that are being sold off. And in our current analysis, we're actually not accounting for changes in plant status because we were worried about there being sort of a mechanical effect. If a couple of plants are sold off, this could mechanically decrease emissions. And so we're thinking about sort of looking at these groups of plants a bit separately, but that's sort of not an issue in the current analysis. And Marco had asked if we had any examples of specific changes that could be consistent with the rapid decline in emissions. And on this end, this is, unfortunately, we've not been able to find quite as many anecdotes, although we actually have talked to a hedge fund that is in our sample. I'm not going to say which one, but we sort of talked about some of the changes that they've made to supply chains. And so that was sort of one of the first order things that they had talked about doing for one of their engagements was changing supply chains. And these would be the types of things that might kick in pretty quickly. But this is still something that we are hoping to provide some more anecdotal evidence for. But,
and that's a really great idea. And my sense is that a lot of hedge funds now have specific people who are in this space who would be happy to talk to you about how sustainability fits in, and particularly what they're doing and how they're thinking about the environmental issues.
Definitely. Well, and so we were actually fortunate. They reached out to us because they'd seen the paper. So we actually, the person that we spoke to was involved with the media aspect of the company, and she'd been working there for many years, and it was very interesting to see to what extent many of our conjectures about how some of this was thought about in practice was actually quite in line with practice. And I think Bo was telling me it's time to move on.
Yeah, my hand signals are working. Thank you, Pat. Great. So I think that was as someone pointed out in the Q&A, that was a great way to take the break for those who don't need to grab another cup of coffee. So thank you all again.